PowerPoint free for this is honestly that, when I was at Stanford and then afterwards, John doesn't use very many PowerPoint slides. He still doesn't, in fact. Most of the talks that, if you look online, you'll find most of the time there's one or two PowerPoints, one or two slides, but mostly it's just telling really interesting philosophical stories. If this turns out a bit dull, it's because I'm not nearly as good a speaker as John. I want to start out by thanking Hasek for his lovely talk and setting me up with the Lego example. I want to now start out the talk by saying that the great thing about Legos is that they work because we made them work. That people spend a lot of time and energy making sure that the manufacture of Legos is perfectly accurate and that the materials are correct so that they do snap together beautifully. I'll also say that if you really hate this talk, you can kind of blame Hasek, because if it weren't for him, I probably would have dropped out of graduate school my first month there when new to the whole world of electronic communications, I continued to get caught in Emacs while trying to read my email and utterly unable to get out of it until Hasek would run over and show me what was wrong. So that's just a small aside there. Okay, I'm going way back to early 1990s as well, and in fact to 1992. So in this case, this is not the metaphysics and epistemology class that everyone had to take. It was just called metaphysics. John was teaching this class. And the point of it, it turned out, was to work through what was then the penultimate draft of the disorder of things, along with reading some of the work to which it responded. Now, unlike many of John's other classes, this class didn't enroll particularly well. I think because the title was just metaphysics. And I don't even know that there was a description in the catalog. In the end, I was one of only 2 students taking it, which had the disadvantage of meaning that I actually had to read everything because you couldn't just like show up and wing it. That was not this turned out to be the first of many times, though, that I read through that book. Okay, now, those of you that have read the book will no doubt remember, along with the reflections on indeterminacy more generally and the problems inherent in what were then contemporary accounts of the nature of probabilistic explanations, there's this interlude on free will. So after noting that we weren't going to get anywhere with free will by appealing to things like quantum level breaks with causal determinism, as John says, not so much an account of a metaphysically free person as a somewhat unreliable one, John noted the following. This longest quote from the published version. I had the draft for a while, but somehow it got lost among the many moves. To the philosophically uncorrupted, what is striking about humans as compared with other natural phenomena is not their unpredictability or their role as sources of disorder in an otherwise reliable and well-ordered universe. Quite the contrary. It is people who appear as somewhat orderly and predictable entities in a generally chaotic world. Where we find order, it is generally because it has been intentionally created by other humans. When I make an arrangement to meet a colleague for lunch sometime next week, I become moderately confident that she will be at a particular determinate place at, say, 12:30 p.m. next Wednesday. It's inconceivable that I can make similar predictions in a scrap of paper that blows by as I'm making the arrangements, unless I pick it up and decide to bring it along. The point is just that humans have all kinds of causal capabilities that nothing else in our world has. Capacities most notably to make and execute all manner of plans and capable of determining their own behavior in complexly organized ways for considerable distances into the future. Skipping a bit here. Thus, the solution I propose to the free will problem is simply to recognize that what is problematic about humans is not that they are exceptions to an otherwise seamless web of causal connection, but that they are extraordinarily dense concentrations of causal capacity in a world in which such order is in short supply. Scientific investigation of the sources of these capacities may help us explain how this is possible, but this begins to explain, not, as determinists often want to suggest, increasingly to problematize this remarkable feature of humans. All right. Now, while developing this take on free will has not been a central part of John's ongoing research agenda, he has taken up the topic again repeatedly, most notably, though by no means only, in his 1996, The Solution to the Problem of the Freedom of the Will, his 2013, How Much of the Free Will Problem Does the Right Kind of Indeterminism Solve, and in a recent talk as part of the 2022 Gifford Lecture Series. Now, a somewhat larger part of John's research agenda has been to criticize the kinds of accounts of human behavior provided by evolutionary psychology, and before that sociology, and human behavior genetics more generally. Many of the accounts that John criticizes are problematic, not just because there's often insufficient evidence for them, or oftentimes very little evidence at all, nor only because they often perpetuate, for example, really terrible gendered stereotypes, but also because they deny, either implicitly or explicitly, the kind of behavioral flexibility that makes change possible, both at the level of individual behavior and at the level of social change. Well, pretty much everyone in evo psych and human behavior genetics adamantly denies that their genetic determinism has the nasty habit of creeping into much of their work. Now, obviously, these research themes, his defense of a particular sort of freedom of the will, and his criticisms of these deterministic accounts of behavior are not unrelated. I'd like to shift a bit to a place where even relatively smart and careful researchers in behavior genetics can go horribly awry when their implicit acceptance of determinism creeps in. Sometimes this is a kind of genetic determinism, sometimes determinism more generally, and I think most often an unholy blend of the two. So, over the past couple decades, I really hadn't been paying much attention to John's work on freedom of the will. Read that part in Disorder, really loved it, and would point students towards it when they come up to me to ask me about freedom of the will questions and get very excited about them. I'd say, I think this is a much more interesting perspective. You should go read this, and then they generally leave me alone. I think they realized that I was not going to be a sympathetic listener to the points they wanted to make. But a few years ago, back in the days of science Twitter, also note that science Twitter is not exactly dead, but it's almost dead. Hasek recently started a little flame war on it by the publication of his book. It's been pretty exciting. But back then I got this email out of the blue from a Twitter mutual that I hadn't actually contacted with in real life at all before, Charles Rosemond. He asked me if I'd read Harden's new book, Genetic Lottery, and if I had, whether the bit about free will in it made any sense. Because he couldn't make any sense of it at all, but thought maybe he was missing something as a non-philosopher. Now, I confess that I read the book, but I'd completely missed the bit about free will. I'd mostly been concerned about the really odd claims that it was making with regards to educational attainment scores, where Harden would beautifully slip back and forth between it's about 50% heritable. Of course, our best polygenetic scores only find about 13% of that, and most of that evaporates within family controls, but really it's 50%. And then her very bizarre and I think some naive Rawlsian moves that she makes throughout the book. But I went back and looked, and I was more than a little surprised to come upon this, and you'll forgive me, I hope, for the longest quote. Eric Turkheimer, my former PhD advisor, proposed that this individuality in human outcomes, which remains after one has considered the constraints of genetics and a family upbringing, is a way of quantifying human agency. His reasoning is this: we consider someone as having a choice and control over an outcome if they could have done differently. If people who share the same accidents of birth, who have the same genetics with the aforementioned qualifications, and the same family upbringing, never actually do turn out differently, it becomes harder to imagine that they could have done so. Unpredictability in this view becomes a sign of freedom. There's a longish quote here that she gives from Eric that I'll come back to later. But now returning to Harden, in Turkheimer's view, the individual phenotypic space that is not determined by either your genotype or the environmental circumstances defines the boundaries in which your free will gets to play. To borrow a phrase from philosopher Daniel Dennett, E2, that's the error term. We usually think of that as the error term in the analysis of variance in behavior genetics. But E2 lets you know how much elbow room you have to choose who you are going to be. Turkheimer then lists various human outcomes, pointing out that identical twins are only minimally different for outcomes that we think of as involving little choice and moral responsibility. The E2 coefficient for height, for example, is less than 0.1. That is, given that one is born to a particular family in a particular time and place with a particular genome, there's little elbow room for how tall you're going to be. But that's height. What about social and behavioral outcomes like education? Okay, a little spoiler alert for those who haven't read the book. Harden thinks that E2 is also low for educational attainment, so there's not a lot of elbow room in there either. Now, I've met Paige, and I've read a fair bit of her work. And while I disagree with her fairly often, she isn't generally unreasonable. And Eric and I have actually published together, and I generally regard him as more or less perfectly reasonable, for a behavior geneticist. So it's some degree of shock that I found them defending such a frankly unhinged position. When Roseman asked me if I wanted to co-author a paper about how utterly misguided this position was, I agreed, but with the warning that I thought the position was so bizarre that it might be really hard to get anyone interested in publishing a criticism of it. I joked that this is like if we'd stumbled upon in a book. Oh, and by the way, obviously, the proper answer to what morality is, it's the tendency to increase the number of yellow things in the world. And then you're like, well, that's obviously wrong. It'd be very hard though, to get anyone to publish a paper saying it was wrong. It was like, how did that? That was where I thought we were going with this. It turned out to be a really fun project. In the end, it did get published. We made extensive use of Dupré, but we didn't really get into determinism and free will in it very much. I want to do that here in a way that shows, I think, how two otherwise reasonable-ish people, Eric and Paige, can be led so far astray. So from here on out, I'm going to focus on Turkheimer's paper, because in some ways it's the more bizarre of the two, if only because he goes into more detail and veers wildly between things that strike me as relatively reasonable and claims that, if you're being charitable, I think just make no sense. All right, so early in the paper, Eric notes that the obvious way to think about these issues is to presume that the higher the heritability of the trait, the more determined it is, determined in quotes here, and the less we can control it, and the less we should be blamed for it. This presumption underlies the thinking of both genetic essentialists and naive environmentalists, but it is incorrect. The reason that it is incorrect, or the reasons that it is incorrect, are related to a simple principle: traits do not have heritabilities. All right. He then goes on to note the ways in which heritability is a very local measure, not a measure of how easy or hard it is to change a trait. All those sorts of things. So good so far. Now I'm going to return to that bit from Harden where I suppressed the quote from Eric. I find the following reflection on free will to be at least compatible with, and in some ways sympathetic to, the view that Dupré takes, at least in its outward form. Free will, Eric says, is the self-determined ability of humans to chart a course for their own lives, constrained but not determined by genes, family, culture, and in response to the vagaries of environmental experience with which they're presented. An embodied free will, tethered to biology, that encompasses our ability to respond to complex circumstances in complex and unpredictable ways, and in the process to build a self. Well, that's all okay. I'll note that, of course, our responses to complex circumstances certainly don't need to be unpredictable in order to be free. In fact, they're generally not. As Dupré notes, many of our responses to complex circumstances are, in fact, perfectly predictable, the more so for people who know us and know our preferences and goals and the like. As an aside here, I want to note there's a bit of decision theory. I read this many, many years ago where they were talking about decision theory in the context of making business decisions. And the author said, look, as it turns out, for all this decision theory stuff, for the most part, the really important decisions in businesses are trivially easy to make because they're blindingly obvious. The right thing to do is so clear that no one would do the other thing. It would just be stupid. And when you get to decisions that are really hard to make, they're generally really hard to make either because there's no way to predict what's going to happen. The pathways between what you do and the outcomes are just so convoluted that there's no tracing them. Or all the different choices are associated with ranges of outcomes that are all kind of the same. And so it's hard to make any difference between them. Now, surely, though, we want to say here that when you're making the easy decisions, you've got to be no less free than when you're making the really difficult ones. The ones that where if you say to yourself, look, I really don't know what to do here because all these options seem about the same. That doesn't seem to have any more to do with freedom of the will than when you're like, oh no, yeah, definitely we should open the business in the morning. All right. I'll note that we, in the end, titled our, Roseman and I titled our paper, Reliability is Not a Vice. We thought that was pretty cute. All right. So getting back to that quote of Eric's, it does seem to capture something plausible about free will. And the criticism of conflating heritability and determinism is, if not terribly original, at least has the advantage of being right. But for all that, and apparently unbound by any desire for consistency, Turkheimer does, in fact, take the heritability of a trait within a population to be a limit on our freedom. Because free will, Turkheimer suggests, is what is left after the variance in a trait associated with genetic variation and that associated with within family environmental variation is removed. The proportion of variance attributable to the non-shared environment is equal to the remainder after the systematic effects of genetic and familial environments have been accounted for. This non-shared environment, in a phrase, is free will. Now, Eric apparently takes this idea seriously, or at least he took it seriously. And a series of long email exchanges, I think I might have convinced him that it's quite silly. The analysis of variance that he suggests, he argues that despite everything being the result of complex developmental processes, he's, oh yeah, developmental challenge, I get it, in which genes and environments are inexorably intertwined. Surely, he says, height is more genetic than oboe playing and less blameworthy than bank robbery. And that this can be cashed out in terms of the heritability of these traits, the shared environmental effects, and the effects of the non-shared environment. I want to pause here and note that it's actually kind of hard to express just what a peculiar view this is. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me for a very philosophical, that is to say quite silly, thought experiment. And I hope it sort of highlights the sort of absurdity of this in a way that's quite hard to get at otherwise. Okay, I want you to imagine a world in which the heritability of ice cream flavor preference is 100%. All the variation in what flavor of ice cream you prefer comes down to being associated with genetic variation. Now, imagine further that this preference is quite strong. In this world, if one's favorite flavor is available, that's the one you're going to get. You'll buy it, you'll ask for it, that's the flavor you want. You're going to try to acquire it, no other. But while that preference is quite strong, if that flavor isn't available, you still like ice cream, and you'll order some ice cream or other, just to sort of whatever's available. You'll get what's there, but you won't enjoy it quite as much as you would have enjoyed your favorite flavor. Now imagine that in this world, most stores, restaurants, your friends' houses really only have 1 or 2 flavors of ice cream available at any given time. Most of the time then, most people when confronted with the option of buying ice cream don't have their favorite flavor available. The rare time it is available, of course, they'll get that one. But when it's not available, they'll get what's there. So it's just sort of catch and catch can most of the time. Now, if we measure the heritability of actual ice cream eating behavior as opposed to preference in this world, it's going to be quite low. A small part of it's going to be associated with the genetic association that's associated with your ice cream flavor preference. But because of the limited availability of the preferred flavor choices, most of the variation is going to come down to the non-shared environment. That is, to whatever flavor happens to be available at that time. Okay, now let's imagine a change in the environment. Stores and restaurants now regularly produce an enormous number of flavors, so that most people, most of the time, are able to get the ice cream flavor that they prefer, and so do so. Measured heritability of ice cream eating behavior in this world will be quite high. Most of the variation will be associated with the genetic association with ice cream flavor preference. The percentage attributable to the non-shared environment will therefore drop precipitously. And notice what's happened here. In moving from a world in which one had to eat whatever ice cream flavor was available to one where one got to choose the flavor, the proportion of variance associated with non-shared environment, and hence the free will component of ice cream eating behavior, on Turkheimer and Harden's view, has actually dropped. In a world where our choices are more efficacious at satisfying our preferences, we lose free will on this model. Now, as a brief aside, you'll often hear that improving the environment will increase the heritability of traits associated with variations in that environment. That, while often said, is actually not terribly well supported. That it does so in this case is because I designed it that way. This is another case where if you sort of force things into that model, they'll work. But in general, we shouldn't trust that. Okay. Now, this is, I admit, an extremely philosophical example and very silly. But finding a more plausible example of non-shared environment that might be associated with free will is, I think, a fool's errand. The idea that developmental noise is free will is so terrible that Harden explicitly rejects that sort of non-shared environment in an endnote. I suspect that it was somewhere along the second or third draft of this that someone said, well, wait a minute, isn't like a lot of the non-shared environment just like developmental noise? Well, that doesn't sound good for free will. Okay, so that's no good. And the other major thing that we always think of as that E squared as being that's measurement error, considering that it's free will seems, if anything, even worse. But that sort of leaves as free will our tendency to be blown hither and thither by random events. But surely that's no more appealing than would be appealing to quantum indeterminacy. So in the end here, despite all this talk of our traits being constrained but not determined by our genes, family, and culture, that they're so constrained would seem to be exactly the model that Turkheimer and Harden assume. The vagaries of environmental experience become free just because they are unpredictable. We are in this picture objects being pushed around the world, and whatever self we create is just the result of a kind of Brownian motion within otherwise relatively tight or loose pathways. That's one place where I wish I was using PowerPoint, because I think it could have come up with a really cool animation there. For some reason, when I picture that, I picture C. elegans in like little slides, which would then get us back to science Twitter and the worm wars. All right. So here is where we see the way in which even researchers who try to avoid genetic determinism become enmeshed in it. When Harden writes that if people with particular features never actually do turn out differently, it becomes hard to imagine that they could have done so. It's a clear reflection of the trap of seeing the world through the lens of a complete causal order, with free will necessarily being some kind of break with that order. And it's also an equivocation between two notions of could, the have the power to versus might actually do so. And here I take it, John would remind us of John Perry's comments on free will and Brussels sprouts. Okay, this is also, I think, the result of seeing the developmentalist challenge to be about what leads to particular kinds of outcomes, where those outcomes are understood to be an organism of some sort, treated as a kind of thing that has particular phenotypic traits. Just as people have heights, so too on this view, must they have, for example, propensities to get divorced, tendencies towards addictive behavior, or for that matter, IQs. I want to follow that line of thought for a moment and note that the idea that people have IQs or even IQ scores has always struck me as fundamentally wrong-headed. And I think that it makes sense not to think of people as having IQs or IQ scores, but rather to think of people's actual performance on IQ tests or their realized IQ test-taking ability. And this isn't, I think, just some odd affectation on my part, but I think it motions towards something important about process thinking. And here we get to some of the later points of John's work. Once we ask not something like, what is this person's IQ? But rather, how does this person tend to perform on these particular IQ tests at these particular kinds of times? We're making the move from thinking of the person as a kind of object with particular features to thinking of the person as Dupré puts it, a process, creating a path of order through a chaotic world. And then questions like, how free are we with respect to, say, our tendency to get divorced if people who are genetically similar to us are also more likely to be similar with respect to their status as divorced or not, starts to seem a little bit silly. If we think not in terms of genes pushing us into becoming certain sorts of people with certain traits, exerting their influence through a developmental process that produces certain phenotypes that we're then stuck with, we think rather in terms of what kinds of paths through our chaotic world we create. The idea that being more genetically similar might sometimes result in our creating more similar paths, all else being equal, seems no more a constraint on our free will than does the fact that people with whom we share more genetic similarities are also more likely to be similar to us with respect to whether they avoid or seek out ordering cilantro-laden dishes in restaurants. Again, all else being equal. There's, of course, much more that one could say about the relationship between these different threads of John's work and the missteps of human behavior genetics. I have, in fact, barely scratched the surface of the bits that were the main focus, that is, John's approach to free will and causal order, and the ways in which the sort of contemporary behavior genetics mucks this up. Still less have I done anything real with the sort of process ontology and the role that this plays in it. But when we move, as John puts it, from seeing the human as an exception of some kind to an otherwise all-encompassing causal order, to seeing the human as the pinnacle of order, the most intricately stabilized system yet known to have emerged or evolved from the surrounding chaos, We also gain a new way of avoiding the pull of interpreting human behavior research, genetic research, as putting limits on our freedom, and better appreciate what that sort of research can and can't tell us about ourselves. Thanks.